In conclusion, I want to thank the witnesses today and the members that participated in today's hearing. I remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions to the record, and I ask that the witnesses all agree to respond promptly to questions. And with that, I adjourn this hearing.
Well, we've got quite a hearing there. I know a lot of you have been watching this live, as I have since the very beginning, and we'd like to entertain any questions that you may have. Not that I'm an expert on all of this, but I have been following the case quite closely. And we do have a couple of questions here now. Live guest 113 asks, are hosting pointless hearings the only way Congress can demonstrate to the public that they do anything at all? Well, 113, I kind of felt that way as this hearing got underway. We had a lot of these congressional people, House members, that were, getting on their soapbox, playing to the TV cameras. But we had several others who asked some really good questions. I thought Tim Murphy's points at the end of how GM could make some of these issues clear to the public were pretty good. We had a number of others who, really asked some pretty good probing questions. So I wouldn't say that that these hearings were pointless, but I would agree overall that there's clearly some members of Congress who are just there for the TV cameras. Okay, we're going to have Gary Vasilash, my co-host for Autoline After Hours, join me for this discussion right now, too, and we'll be bringing him in just a moment. Hello, Gary.
Yes.
Yeah, John here.
Hi, John.
So, we'll be answering some of the questions from the audience here, and I'm glad that you're joining me to do that. The first question that we just got to was live guest 113 thought that these hearings were kind of pointless. And, well, I thought they got off kind of slow and that there were clearly members of the House who were only playing to the TV cameras. I thought there were some other questions that were actually pretty good, too, and was curious what your reaction is.
Well, I must say that it's probably the first time that in the House of Representatives that people were talking about 20 Newton centimeters, talking about pointlessness, it seems. I agree with you that there were some awfully good questions, and it surprised me how it seemed that across the board, across the aisle, that Congress seemed to come together, and they came together to attack General Motors. I mean, it's quite incredible.
Well, one of the points that I thought was a good point that was being made by Congresswoman DeJette was that they're still worried about GM's culture. This committee clearly is not convinced that General Motors has made an overnight conversion where all of a sudden now all of its employees are really going to do the right thing, and that management's really going to be responsible for this. And I think that's a legitimate concern on the part of this committee, that how can all these people who have spent all their careers at General Motors now all of a sudden say things are hunky-dory and they're doing the right thing?
Right. I mean, there's no question. I mean, if you look at what Representative Murphy was saying at the beginning and then at the end, he said the title of the Lucas report ought to be "Don't Assume Malfeasance When Incompetence Will Do." I mean, that speaks straight to the culture of the organization. And, unless that's changed, they're not going to be as improved as I think the current leaders of the company hope that it will be.
We've got another question. This one comes in from live guest 930, who asks, was GM's practice of not keeping meeting records and not informing top management about some matters really a defense against potential lawsuits? If there's no documents and the top execs are ignorant, then suing lawyers have less info to gather from discovery. And I think that was exactly it. Live guest 930, you're right on top of it. GM had told its employees, its engineers, specific words that they were not supposed to use in any kind of memos because these words might be used against the company if any problems came up in the future in a lawsuit. There's no question that they either did not or were afraid to report a lot of this information up the line. There's a very good article in Bloomberg today that came out of how whistleblowers would essentially see their careers terminated. Not that they would be fired from GM, but if they blew the whistle and persisted in trying to blow the whistle on problems in the company, they would be essentially assigned to Siberia. So even though they were not fired, their careers for all practical purposes would come to an end. Gary, I don't know what your reading on that is, but it sure seems like the culture in GM was to try to keep any kind of problem contained within the company and not even let it out amongst anybody who could do something about it.
Well, John, as you and I have talked about on the show, that we've got to put this into the context of when a lot of this was happening, and this was happening at a point in time when there was a pretty big downturn in the industry, and if you're working at your job and you see something's wrong and you know that it's going to have a negative consequence on your boss, what's the likelihood you're going to want to raise your hand because you know that the guy who used to be sitting at the desk next to you had just gotten a cardboard box and was escorted out of the building, and the other guy who was sitting on the other side of you had been escorted out the day before, you're going to not necessarily have a willingness to say, gee, I think there's a problem here, boss, and you did something wrong, and because you want to keep your job. Now, I'm not saying that's right, but I think that's human nature.
Yeah.
And, again, it gets back to the thing, is this malfeasance, or is this incompetence? And that I think is the fundamental here.
Yeah, to me, that's kind of splitting hairs in a way. It's just incredible that this was a problem that a lot of people in the company knew about that went on for years, and yet nothing really happened. Well, I guess I should take that back. There was a fix that was put in place, but clearly this engineer, DiGiorgio, didn't let anybody know about it. And I find that hard to believe that he single-handedly could hide that from the system, but that's what the Valukas report seems to suggest.
Yeah, and you heard Mary Barra describe Ray DiGiorgio as being, quote, not credible. So, saying that you got to really cast doubt on what was going on with him. But one of the things that surprised me is that, you and I have been covering this industry for a long time, and when General Motors initiated the PPAP process, the Production Part Approval Package process, that, you've heard, both of us, I'm sure, heard from suppliers about, how onerous this was and how difficult this was and how complicated this was. And yet, it came out in the hearings today that, they looked for the PPAP package about this ignition switch, it's not around. That seems very curious to me.
Well, Valukas was also, pointing the finger quite a bit at Delphi and almost suggesting that Delphi might have that kind of info, even though Delphi had informed Valukas that they can't find the information on it. Yeah, that's very curious that kind of information would not be available.
Right. And to get back to the first question about whether this is political grandstanding on behalf of Congresspeople, I thought it was sort of interesting how Representative Tonko from New York was talking about well, maybe we need more laws and we need to strengthen this. When you get right down to it, again, this is an issue of people, that people are either going to do the right thing or the wrong thing, and whether there's a law or not a law, it isn't going to make that much of a difference fundamentally. And therefore, this drives straight to the point of, that General Motors, and I'm sure that other corporations have the same problem, that the culture is not one of people being willing and open to share information.
That's exactly true. It clearly was a big problem at GM. I wonder how much it's really changed inside right now. I guess you and I will have to do some digging on our own with some of the people that we know in the company to see if they really perceive that there's been a change.
Right. Well, but look, this is sort of like somebody who's going to quit smoking, right? They smoked for 20 years and they go, oh, I'm going to quit, right? So it takes a long time for that to really happen, right? I mean, it takes years. You don't like, oh, I quit last week and now I started again. I mean, you can't change culture in a matter of weeks. It takes a long time for that to happen. But I think the danger is that some people at General Motors might think that the culture has changed because they say it often enough, and it doesn't really connect. It really doesn't permeate into the organization all the way down the way it needs to. But again, this is just not them. I think this is lots of organizations. You heard reference made during the testimony today to the problem at the VA. Okay, now what could be more horrible than that? People who deserve treatment not getting it, or being shunted aside, or so on and so forth. So you see General Motors, you see the VA, and I'm sure we could see many other organizations where this is a problem.
Yeah. Want to suggest to anyone watching, shoot us an email right now or shoot us a question. You can also give us a call. Gary and I would be happy to entertain your questions. The number to call is 1-620-288-6546. And we've got another question here from live guest 158 who asks, which members of Congress do you think had the most insightful questions? I kept kind of a running total. I thought Tim Murphy, the chairman, did a pretty good job. I thought his co-chair, Ms. DeJette, did a pretty good job. Let's see, Kathy Castor from Florida, I thought, did a pretty good job. So did Renee Elmers from North Carolina. And also Griffith from Virginia, I thought, did a pretty good job too. But there was some others that I thought were, like I said before, just playing to the cameras. There was a Mr. Butterfield who asked Valukas to define the GM nod and the GM salute. I mean, anybody who's following this story knows that in spades, and why he would, with his opportunity to ask a really good question, would ask, I think, something very peripheral to what was going on.
Yeah, I thought it was Billy Long from Missouri. Did you happen to catch that big eye roll that he did when he was talking to Valukas?
No, I was taking notes and stuff, so I didn't find all of their see all their facial expressions.
That was rather astonishing. He seemed to be completely skeptical about everything, and he had that sort of interesting, but I don't know how relevant statistic where his staff calculated that Valukas must have looked at 1,220 documents per minute in order to have come up with his report.
Yeah, but that's if this was 10 years ago, I would have thought that that's a good question. But in these days, when you've got big data analysis tools that can dive through reams and reams of documents looking for keywords or phrases or things like that, I mean, this guy should know. With our government doing that with all our phone calls and everything else too, here's somebody who should know better that the tools are available to be able to go through that kind of documentation.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that was brought up several times, and I think that Representative Jeanette, who you mentioned, did a particularly impassioned approach to, is when she was talking to Valukas about how the stalling problem was not perceived internally at General Motors as being a safety issue, but a, quote, customer convenience issue. And she basically said, that's insane, isn't it? And then Valukas replied, well, I wouldn't use that word.
Right.
But it seemed pretty clear that the people who were internal who were saying, oh, it's just a customer convenience problem, so we don't have to elevate it, so we don't have to address it, so we don't have to really, fundamentally fix it. That is insane.
Yeah.
It's just very surprising.
Yeah, very surprising. We've got another question from live guest 158. What grade would you give Mary Barra's performance compared to the last time?
my personal sense of it is that she was better speaking at, like, when she made her statement, okay, she was better at the town hall meeting than she was this time or the previous time. I almost got the sense from just looking at her that, boy, if this thing had run for about, 20 minutes longer, she would have started tearing her hair out.
Yeah, I would say I'd give her a C or a C plus. This was much better of a delivery than the last time around, which made me cringe. That's how bad it was the last time. This time she did not make me cringe, but she has not yet come off, at least at these hearings, as a really in-charge kind of captain of industry, really running the ship. And I would go on to say, too, that, the members of the House of Representatives are not in the same league as those in the Senate. The Senate hearings, which are going to be in a couple of weeks here, next month, they're going to be far tougher than this was. And I'm not yet convinced that Barra will put in the kind of performance that she needs to convince the Senate that she's really got her arms around this problem, this culture problem, and is getting it changed.
But, one of the problems that she fundamentally has, though, is how do you explain the inexplicable?
Meaning?
I mean, so as, she described the thing as a unique series of mistakes over a long period of time. Okay, that's what her phrase was in terms of describing what happened. Okay, I mean, how can you possibly convince somebody of the fact that, this unique series of mistakes makes sense? I mean, it doesn't. It just seems beyond words.
It really does, and is. And look, this is why this mistake is, has led the company to recall some 20 million vehicles. I think the count's up to now. They're going to lose billions of dollars on all of this. And, this really shows the results of just sort of sticking your head in the sand and ignoring what is a pretty serious problem.
And, I thought that that Murphy's point near the end was also sort of interesting when he started asking about the frequently asked questions that's on the official GM ignition recall safety information page. And it is sort of surprising because question number 7 says, are the recalled vehicles safe to drive? Answer. The simple answer to that question is yes. So GM engineers have done extensive analysis to make sure that if you only use the ignition key with no additional items on the key ring, the vehicle is safe to drive. Well, one of the recalls earlier this week for the current generation Chevy Camaro, the fix for that is the fact that the key is part of a key fob, which is sort of heavy, and just that is going to be changed to a normal key. Therefore, one could conclude, well, maybe that isn't safe to drive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I thought Murphy's point that the language of that fact, the frequently asked questions, should have been much more specific in telling people the dangers that they face, rather than the way that GM worded it in that fact, that, oh yeah, just take everything off the key ring and you're safe to go.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we learned a little bit more, not a whole lot. I can't say that it's going to be easy to write any story about what these hearings turned up, but I still go back to, I think the much tougher testimony will come with the Senate's investigation in a couple of weeks.
Well, but it just occurred to me, John, if we're going to be fair to Mary Barra and her performance in front of these guys, if we think back to the hearings of Congress when Rick Wagner and Bob Nardelli were in front of the senators, I mean, they didn't pull themselves off being particularly captains of industry.
No, they were horrible. They were terrible.
Right.
It was one of the worst performances ever.
So I think we need to cut her a little slack here.
Yeah, I don't know. To me, I'm not going to cut her. I'm not going to say, well, let's cut her slack because those guys were mediocre too. I keep referring back to when Lee Iacocca showed up to testify in front of Congress. Now, you knew that was the chief executive officer of the Chrysler Corporation. Right. So that's what I'm looking for more now. I know this is not quite the same. And I did say I think Mary did a much better job this time around. But it's not like she's winning over the hearts and minds of America with these kinds of answers.
Well, I think for, the good news for her is probably that the large majority of Americans won't even have any idea that she was there today. And again, that Tim Murphy made an interesting point of that, people probably won't pay attention until it's on a comedy network show when people are talking about it.
Yeah. Hey, we got another question from Scott in Cleveland. I think he's been on this from the very beginning. He says, do you predict, after all is said and done, that GM will switch to a push-button start across the board? Thoughts, Gary?
I believe they will. And I think a number of their competitors have pretty much gone that way almost entirely. I can't think of a Nissan car, for example, that doesn't have a push-button start.
Yeah, even some of the most entry-level cars these days have push-button starts. But to Scott in Cleveland's question, yeah, I'll bet this accelerates the move to push-button start, especially at General Motors, just so that, what a great way to erase that image from the public's mind, that there might be some problem with a key. No, there is no more key to speak of. There's just a button to push on the dash.
Right, but even if and when that happens, okay, it still doesn't solve the bigger issue. So maybe it's not the key, the ignition switch, the cylinder. Maybe it's an accelerator problem, or maybe it's a suspension component problem, or maybe it's another problem. That's what has to get worked out here. It has to be worked out that people have a willingness to say, you know what, that casting is probably not the casting we've got to use for that component, or gee, we've got a sticky whatever here. So it isn't just necessarily changing the parts; it's changing the way people think about those parts.
Right. Yep, I would agree. Well, look, I think it's a good time to wrap this up. I think we've provided a little bit of good analysis right after these hearings. I think we'll be doing more of these kinds of things in the future where we react live to immediately breaking news. Want to thank everybody who has tuned in. Gary, I especially want to thank you for having joined me.
Not at all. I'm sure I'll talk about this tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night on After Hours. This will continue to be a topic of conversation, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks again, Gary, and thanks everybody else for having tuned in.
Okay, thanks.